Доброго дня! Раді вітати вас на черговій події публічної програми до виставки номінанток та номінантів премії Future Generation Art Prize, що триває зараз в Пінчук арт-центрі. Запрошуємо вас її побачити на власні очі, а також слідкувати за подіями публічної програми в наших соціальних мережах. Протягом листопада в рамках публічної програми ми обговорюємо тему духовності та можливостей переосмислення цього концепту сьогодні в реаліях сучасного світу та в контексті сучасних філософських пошуків. І одним з понять, що часто виринає в розмовах про духовність, є поняття моралі. І сьогоднішня наша лекція покликана дещо розхитати наші звичні уявлення щодо цього поняття. І я рада вам представити нашу сьогоднішню лекторку Крістін Ендрюс. Крістін викладає філософію в Йоркському університеті в Канаді, а також очолює там кафедру досліджень свідомості тварин. Вона є авторкою таких праць, як «Чи читають мавпи думки» до нової народної психології та «Свідомість тварин. Вступ до філософії тваринного сприйняття». А також вона є співавторкою книги «Права шимпанзе. Філософський огляд» та співредакторкою збірки текстів «Довідник Рутледж з філософії розуму тварин». І наразі Крістін працює над дослідженням еволюції нормативного мислення. А тема її сьогоднішньої лекції звучить так: «Чи є тварини моральними?». І я передаю слово Крістін в надії почути відповідь на це інтригуюче запитання. Дуже дякую.
Thanks so much, Lisha, for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here to talk to you all about this question that I find really fascinating, and that is, are animals moral? And in one sense, an answer to this question is very simple, and we could just all stop now, and we could answer it, yes, animals are moral, some of them, because humans are animals and humans are moral. We're the paradigmatic moral creature. And in fact, some people even define humans as the moral animal. But I think that if we spend some time investigating what we mean by morality and being moral, and we look at some of the current science on animal behavior, that we find that this idea that humans are the only moral animals is worthy of challenging. And in fact, by the end of the talk, I hope to convince you that we're not the only moral animals, but some other animals are moral as well. So first, we can look at this question: what is morality? What do we mean by morality? So it's not a question about whether or not some animal is good or bad. It's not like, you know, is Joe a nice guy? Or is this a good dog or a bad dog? So the question is about species, is about a property, whether a species has a property of being moral. So when we say that humans are moral, what we're saying is that humans can act well or they can act poorly. That is, our actions deserve evaluation. I can do something that's right, and I can do something, unfortunately, that's wrong. And when I do things that are wrong, I'm subject to censure from people around me who evaluate my actions and ask me to do better next time, or maybe who punish me for doing something wrong. So in this sense of humans being moral or being moral, even the worst person in the world is moral. It's why we get so angry at him for doing bad things, because we hold him up to standards that we think he should live up to. So it seems like with this understanding of being moral, we could just look at moral theory that philosophers have worked on in order to apply the question to non-human animals. That is, we can take a theory of morality off the shelf and then say, well, these are the properties that the moral theory says you need in order to be a moral agent. Do non-human animals have these properties? And while it seems like it would be an easy task, as soon as we start looking at moral theories, we realize how difficult that would be. So to begin with, there are lots of different moral theories, and these moral theories differ not just across time and not just across the globe, but also right now. There just isn't a lot of agreement about what it means to be moral. So just a couple of examples. About 2,000 years ago, the Confucian debates about the nature of morality between two philosophers, Mengzi and Xunzi, were a debate between whether morality just is acting naturally. That was Mengze's view. He said humans are naturally good. And you can tell this because when you see a child who fell into a well, everyone is completely and immediately taken by them. They care about the child, they rush over and try to help the child. That is just the way we are. We are just a naturally good moral being. And all we have to do to make sure we act well is to get rid of any barriers to acting poorly. The same way that water from the top of a hill will just continue down the hill into a pond unless there are dams stopping it. So let's remove the dams and then we'll all be good actors. Xunzi, on the other hand, said, but Mengze, no, obviously humans are not naturally good. We're naturally selfish and greedy. Look at the baby who, as soon as they're born, starts screaming for milk, wanting things, children stealing toys, adults being greedy. We are not naturally good. In fact, we need to be taught good through artifice. We have to listen to the teachings of the sages and do what they say, follow those rules in order to be good. Now, that's one debate. Another debate we see from Western philosophy over the years shows a similar lack of agreement about what it means to be moral. So we have, starting with Aristotle, the idea that being moral is developing your own individual virtues. And if you act to improve yourself, then you're going to be a moral being. So anyone who can improve themselves will be moral. On the other hand, you have a very different picture that emerges from Immanuel Kant's writing, where he argues that a moral agent has to be a rational individual who scrutinizes their reasons for action. Then you've got another very different view coming from David Hume, who says that the morality stems from one's emotions, and having emotions, moral sentiments, is what's necessary for being a moral agent. And then you have John Stuart Mill, who argued that a moral agent is someone who's going to be calculating expected outcomes and figuring out which outcomes are going to maximize utility, something like happiness, for all the people who are impacted by your actions. Now, this is a lot of disagreement that we get from philosophers in ethical theory. And so we're not going to be able to answer the question, are animals moral, by appealing to theory. I mean, arguably, we can't even derive human morality from some of these moral theories. If a moral agent has to be good at scrutinizing their reasons for action, thinking about, why did I do that? And is that reason that I had one that could satisfy some constraints that everybody could live by? Or if to be a moral agent, you have to be very good at predicting how your actions are going to make other people happy or sad. Contemporary moral psychology doesn't find very strong abilities in humans for achieving those sorts of goals. So humans might not even be moral if we really strictly follow some of the claims from moral theory. So instead of starting with a moral theory from philosophy, we might want to start by looking at pro-social tendencies and take instead a biological and psychological approach to the question, are animals moral? By looking at practices that are found across cultures and that are associated with morality, we can then ask whether those practices are found in animals without having any moral theory about what it means to be a moral actor, a moral agent. So what are some of these moral practices that we find across cultures? Typically, we have a list of pro-social capacities like cooperation or altruism, helping, reciprocity, so like I help you, then you help me, reconciliation after fights, concerns for fairness, that are appealed to by both psychologists and anthropologists who are looking across cultures to see what people actually take to be morally important, and also by biologists who are looking at how it is that humans could live in very large groups in a way that makes those groups stable, that makes it such that we can, trust one another enough to not worry about being killed in our sleep. And so I want to go through these moral practices when it comes to non-human animals, and show you how we see evidence of these moral practices in other species. So when I said this is also a biological approach, it's a biological approach because it was very quickly recognized that non-human species engage in some of these practices. Altruism is the first case I'll be looking at. And it raised a bit of a puzzle for theories of evolution. Why should I help somebody when my goal in life is to pass on my genes? Why should I engage in behavior that is altruistic, that is a cost to myself and a benefit to you? And biologists have had a variety of answers, pretty good answers to these questions, like, well, if your friend is then going to help you later, then it's ultimately a help to you to help your friend. Or if you're helping a relative, of course, that's going to benefit your genes being passed on because you share genes with your relative, things like that. But the case that had puzzled the biologists to begin with was the behavior of the vampire bat. So vampire bats are animals that feed on blood, and they go out at night and they look for a cow or someone to suck blood from in order to have a nice meal. But you're not always successful at finding blood. And what the biologists observed is that when a vampire bat came back at the end of the night to roost and they hadn't gotten a meal, one of their group mates would regurgitate blood into their mouth, sharing the meal that they had successfully found. So this is a classic example of altruism. I got dinner, but I'm going to give up some of my dinner by throwing some of it up into your mouth so you can have dinner too. It's a very nice altruistic behavior that I find very disgusting. So altruism is found widely across different species. It is not a very strange behavior to see in non-human animals. Reconciliation is a behavior that was discovered more recently in non-human animals, and Frans de Waal is the biologist who's really, I think, associated most strongly with the idea that non-human animals also engage in reconciliation. This is an image from one of his early books of chimpanzees who had been in a fight, and after the fight were trying to repair the relationship, right? So you have a fight with somebody, but you still have to live with them. How do you manage that? Well, you have to make up, and chimpanzees make up as well by reaching out a friendly hand and then engaging in physical contact with one another. What's been cool is since it's been looked at in other species in the last 30 years or so, every social mammal that's been studied so far has shown reconciliation behaviors except one. Domestic cats. So we see evidence of it in spotted hyenas, in lions, in dolphins, in the dwarf mongoose, in domestic goats, and in dogs. Maybe cats do reconcile, but so far the scientists haven't been able to find evidence of it. What does goat reconciliation look like? Well, it looks like coming close to one another and nuzzling each other with their faces, muzzle contact or muzzle body contact, grooming, lying in proximity, things like that. So reconciliation is broadly seen across species. The next moral practice is empathy. Empathy is a fellow feeling with another member of your group, another person. I feel empathy for somebody when they're in distress, and I seek to alleviate their distress. And empathy is also something that's found widely across species. One of my favorite examples these days are the studies on rat empathy. And this image is from an Aeon magazine article that the philosopher Susanna Monceau and I wrote together, published in 2020, where we examine the case of rat empathy and compare it to chimpanzees and monkeys. What these recent studies have found is that if they've done a couple kind of mean studies to rats, so rats are living together in cages, they form, you know, relationships with the other rats in their cages, and then one of the rats is taken out of the enclosure and put in a tube, a plastic tube that's clear. And this clear plastic tube is put in a different enclosure, and then inside that enclosure, another of the cage mates gets placed. So the rat outside of the tube is able to open the tube and release the trapped rat. And what the researchers found is that the free rat immediately would open the tube and release their trapped cage mate. But they wondered if the reason why the rat freed their cage mate was because they just found it really annoying that the trapped rat was squeaking in this aversive way, right? So sometimes when individuals are upset and making a lot of noise, or you know, asking for help, we turn the channel, or we look away, or somehow ignore them. So what the researchers did is they gave the rats an opportunity to ignore the trapped cage mate by escaping. Even in that case, the rat would release their cage mate from the restrainer. And then the kind of final study in the series was, well, what happens if we put chocolate in the cage? Even rats like chocolate a lot. And what they found is that the rat who could either go eat the chocolate all by himself or release his cage mate would first release his cage mate, and then both of them would go and share the chocolate. Right? So this is an example of a case that I think offers very strong evidence that the rat is motivated by this kind of fellow feeling response to the suffering of the cage mate, and showing empathy. We see this behavior in great apes, in all sorts of species, from prairie voles to dolphins, and this is not something that is all that unusual as well. So empathy is yet another property widely seen. Cooperation is an interesting property that is thought to be a cultural universal for humans. In order to live together in big groups, we have to get along. We have to work together to protect ourselves from predators and make sure that we build the kind of social structures that we need to live. So do other species engage in cooperation as well? Well, there's evidence that they do. So this is an image of chimpanzees who have to work together to pull a bar at the same time in order to access a food reward. Variations of these experiments have been done with other species, including elephants and marmosets. So if you have to work together in order to achieve a goal, and then you've got a case of cooperation. Fairness is another example of a cultural universal moral practice. The idea that, you know, like behavior should get like responses. So this is a task that Sarah Brosnan and Frans de Waal did with capuchin monkeys, and they gave these two monkeys the same task, but gave them different rewards for the same task. So the monkey that you see in this little GIF got cucumber for the task, whereas the monkey next to him received a delicious grape. And the monkey who got the cucumber ended up quitting working and getting upset, in some cases throwing the cucumber back, even though if everyone was getting a cucumber, it was a perfectly good reward. These sorts of inequity aversion studies have been done on other species, including domestic dogs and corvids, like ravens and children. And we see this in a number of different species. Okay, finally, the last property of moral behavior I want to talk about is helping behavior. So we already saw cooperation, but then there's also helping, and helping is kind of a wide variety of things. So what I have here in this picture is from a study of elephants that engage in consolation behavior. So if after one elephant loses a fight, a friend comes over and engages in tactile reassurance. So helping, and one form of helping is emotional helping, make me feel better after I had a fight. Another form of helping would be, recognizing your lack of capability and engaging in some sort of behavior that facilitates you achieving a goal. So one example I like a lot is this work on chimpanzee road crossing. Some wild chimpanzees live in areas that have human roads going through them. Human roads are dangerous because cars go on them, cars can hit chimpanzees and kill them. And so what scientists has observed are that the chimpanzees will help one another cross the road, that alpha males and bigger individuals will work with smaller individuals or lower ranking individuals or naive individuals and assist them in crossing the road. Kind of the way that we do with small children in a busy city. All right, so I've just run through some examples of these moral practices that are found across human cultures and shown that a lot of these moral practices are also found in animal cultures. How do we get from moral practices, though, to having morality, right? So there have been a few critiques of how well we're able to make this leap from moral practices to having morality. Some of these critiques come from feminist ethics, who say we really have to ask questions about what's the nature and the point of morality. What's it for? What's its functions? And then if we know what it's for and what are its functions, then we can ask what sort of arrangements or social institutions morality actually is. That this is a productive way of actually moving forward and asking questions about animal morality. And anthropologists have also been studying cross-cultural behavior in humans, nonetheless, have had a difficulty going from looking at these moral practices to giving an adequate account of what morality itself is. So these questions remain. And what I think that would be really beneficial to do to get this movement, right, from moral practices to having morality is to look at that ancient Confucian debate between natural morality and artificial morality between Mengzi and Xunzi. So this idea that we're naturally good is really what we saw when we were looking at these moral practices. And one might worry that, oh, well, sure, animals have pro-social tendencies. They help and cooperate and show empathy and so on and so forth. You'd expect that from any social living animal because they have to live in large groups. But does that mean that others evaluate their behavior, that they do a better or worse job in the eyes of their community members? Right. And so what Xunzi was asking us to do is say, listen, there are some rules that we follow in order to be moral, and then we evaluate people based on the rules that we introduce in the society. Because it's not just that there are pro-social tendencies in non-human animals. There are, as Xunzi said, egoistic tendencies as well, right? So we should get shoulds out of having morality, that we're doing behavior we should be doing or ought be doing, and avoiding behavior we ought not be engaging in. And we get these shoulds in human behavior because while humans have pro-social tendencies, we're also egoistic and selfish. And our culture and our education helps us to learn how to balance self-directed and other directed interests, right? Our egoistic and our pro-social tendencies. And becoming moral is an accomplishment for humans who are able to balance these two tendencies. Now, our cultures help us do this because they have, over time, as they've stabilized, developed rules for living that help individuals cooperate and coordinate with one another. And then we transmit these rules to our offspring. So if we can examine whether animals have morality in this sense, we have to start looking at animal cultures. And there's now abundant evidence of culture, of socially inherited patterns of behavior and information, including group-specific traditions, right? So some chimpanzees use sticks in order to get honey out of bees' nests, and other chimpanzees don't do this behavior. So there are these traditions, behaviors that are culturally different between different groups of the same species. So culture in this sense exists in a wide variety of non-human animals, including apes and monkeys and cetaceans like whales and dolphins, in birds and in fish. And there's also been evidence of culture in some insects, such as bumblebees and fruit flies. And so this has been a very exciting development in animal cognition and animal behavior research in the last 20 years, when in 1999, the first paper was published in the West on chimpanzee culture. So if there's culture, then we can ask, well, are there then social norms? Are there rules for behavior that are part of this inheritance, this cultural inheritance that is passed down? And in order to ask that question, we have to have an account of what we mean by a social norm. And so a social norm we can understand very simply as there being a pattern of behavior in place, and that individuals can conform to that pattern or not. So there's some sort of cognitive flexibility or choice to copy the behavior. And then most critically, individuals in that group expect that other people, other members of their group will conform to the behavior so they can predict what they're going to do. And they sanction those who don't conform to the behavior. That is, there's this kind of social maintenance that happens in cultures so that when individuals conform to the expected pattern, they get rewards. The rewards might be simply things go smoothly and I'm coordinating really well with one another. The way conforming to my walking on the right allows me to make my way in a busy subway station without running into people constantly, because that's what everybody else is doing. But that's a kind of reward. Or when I violate the norm, I get sanctions of some sort, and that sanction might be punishment. It might be throwing me in jail, but most often it's not that kind of punishment. It is some sort of irritation. It might be running into the person, other people on the subway platform because I'm standing in the wrong place or walking the wrong way. It might be someone giving me a nasty look for violating a norm. So if we understand social norms that way, then we can look in non-human animal communities and see, are there patterns of behavior where there's social maintenance, where we see evidence that there's sanctioning of violations and rewards for conformity? And I've identified a number of different places we could look for social norms in chimpanzee communities in particular. And I picked chimpanzees not because they're the only example of an animal who I think would have social norms, but because they've been studied for so long, we have the best range of data right now about chimpanzees. And so I just want to go through a couple of these to discuss what these social norms might look like in chimpanzees. The next slide has an image on it that might be disturbing to some of you because it's the social norm of infanticide avoidance. So if you don't want to see it, look away. In this social norm would be a prohibition against killing infants. Now, you need prohibitions against behaviors that sometimes happen, right? And infanticide is rare in chimpanzee communities, but it does happen. And cannibalism has also been observed, as you see in this image from Nishi and Nakamura. What we found, though, is that what researchers have found, though, is that when males start mishandling infant chimpanzees, unrelated females will protest and attempt to intervene in this mishandling. So you do see a sanctioning behavior that even unrelated females, so even they're not trying to protect the infant because they're their own biological material, but because this, it looks like, is a violation of a rule about how you should treat infants. Another example of a social norm in chimpanzees might be something a little less dark, that is fashion trends. So the example I have here is we have a chimpanzee who started wearing a piece of straw in their ear in a sanctuary setting. And this was the alpha female. And after she put the straw in her ear, this behavior spread to other members of the group and became a trend. So just like some of our social norms are kind of silly about what brand of backpack or boots we should be wearing, maybe there's some silly social norms in chimpanzees as well. We don't have evidence here of social maintenance, but we could look for evidence of social maintenance in these sorts of situations to see whether there's a different sort of status that's given to individuals who conform to this behavior versus individuals who don't. The same way we can look at human schools and see who conforms to this fashion trend. Are they the cool kid or are they not the cool kids? That would be some evidence of social maintenance in those contexts as well. So another example of conformity is in the case of immigration. When you move to a new community, you often have to change your behavior to conform to the behavior that you see around you in order to be accepted into that community. And there's evidence of social conformity after immigration in non-human animals as well. So this is a picture of vervet monkeys who were raised on one colored corn. They were taught by their parents, their mother, that the other kind of corn wasn't edible. And so they only ate the one color. There were 4 communities, 2 communities where the infants learned to eat pink corn, other 2 communities, they learned to eat blue corn. And then when the infants grew up and immigrated, very luckily, they immigrated to groups where people ate the different color corn. And so what happened was that the immigrants, all but one, shifted to eat the color of the corn that they'd never eaten before and that they had been taught to avoid by their mother. This is a very weird behavior because from a purely biological perspective, if you've got some food and nobody else wants it, then you should go for it. Like, this is a resource that you don't have to compete for. But it seems like even for vervet monkeys, when in Rome is the rule of the day. Now, the one exception I told you about was a male who immediately became the leader of that group. So he didn't have to conform because he already had a way of getting dominance in that group to begin with. And the last example of a social norm in non-human animals comes from elephants. So elephant herds who lose their matriarchs often lose cultural knowledge as well as to say where important resources are, like where is a water hole that we only have to travel to in times of drought. And so we know that female elephants and the matriarchs have this important knowledge. And researchers who've been studying traveling patterns in African elephants have found that there's a deference to the matriarch in making traveling plans. So when there's disagreement about which way to go, the other members of the group tend to follow the matriarch. Now, is this a social norm? Again, we'd have to do a really careful study and look to see what happens when other group members don't follow the matriarch compared to what happens to the individuals who do follow the matriarch, and see if there's a social maintenance aspect in play in these kind of cases too. So here we have some examples of social norms or potential social norms in non-human animals. At least these are places we could plausibly find social norms. But what about moral norms, right? How do we get from social norms about like wearing fashionable clothing and straw in the ear and eating pink corn to moral norms about, avoiding killing one another or helping people who need help? So this brings us to the point of the fact that there are cultural differences in what counts as a moral norm versus a social norm across human cultures as well, right? There's some disagreements about what is the right thing to do. Cultures and even within cultures have widespread disagreement about the morality of practices, from punishment via death penalty to which people can get married and at what age you can get married, to debates about what women can do with their pregnancies, and so on and so forth. And so when we say that chimpanzees might have morality and orangutans might have morality, what we're not saying is that what their morality looks like is something that we would approve of, right? So Klingons on Star Trek have morality. They're moral in the sense I've been describing, but very few of us would probably say that Klingon morality is really what we should aspire for, when Klingon morality promotes, violence and honor and dominance and so on and so forth. Things that, maybe doesn't fit well with everyone or suit everyone. So chimpanzee morality might look like Klingon morality a little bit, with value placed on dominance and physical power. Well, orangutan morality might look very different and be a little bit more involved with a kind of hands-off way of morality, live and let live sense of what are the rules, don't intervene too much, given the way their lives are structured as semi-solitary animals. So once we've got social norms, I think the move to moral norms we can get that pretty quickly, because if we just include in the realm of moral norms these sorts of pro-social tendencies that we already know exist, we're in the topic of morality, and we have social norms that have to do with things like proper treatment of infants, deference to matriarchs, and so on. And these are things that could look very much like the sorts of moral norms that are paradigmatic in human communities. Now, I just want to end by pointing out that accepting animal morality has a number of benefits. Right? It might be a weird way to think, just kind of switch your thinking and looking at other animal species as also individuals who participate in cultures where there's social norms that are socially enforced by group members, such that individual behavior is approved and disapproved of. But what are these benefits? I think to philosophy, we see benefits because ethical theorists will have a richer conception of morality to draw from. Right now, in ethical theory, philosophers are looking at humans as the paradigmatic case of moral beings. And if you take as your study group a narrow subset of the individuals who have the property at interest, you're going to bias your results, right? Just like if you're doing medicine and you're testing a drug on 16-year-old boys and then trying to generalize from that about how this drug will interact with 50-year-old women, you're not going to be doing very good science. So if we can expand our subject pool to begin with, we'll be doing better work in ethical theory. I also think that accepting animal morality has benefits to science, because comparative cognition researchers can use shared concepts of morality to examine similarities and differences between species, right? Once we say it's okay to examine social norms in non-human animals, for example, we can then ask, oh, what kinds of social norms do we see in the octopus, or in a bearded dragon, in a snake, in an orangutan? And are there similarities between those species, and are there differences? And do those similarities and differences cluster in interesting ways that help us understand those species better? And then finally, and probably most importantly, accepting animal morality has benefits to animals, because it offers us further reasons to see animals and animal habitat and animal cultures as morally considerable, as entities worthy of moral concern. It's not required that animals are moral for us to care about animals morally, right? They could be moral patients and not be moral agents. But once we see that they're moral agents, it opens up additional ways in which we need to care for non-human animals. We have to care about them as moral actors and give them opportunities to exercise their cultural abilities and moral abilities as well. All right, so just to summarize the kind of argument that I've been making in this talk, if morality is a human universal, if it's something that all human cultures have, then we should conceive of it as a balance or a dance between pro-social tendencies and egoistic desires. And this dance happens through social norms that allow individuals to live together in harmony in groups. Then non-human animals are moral beings too. Thank you very much for your attention.